Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Today we're going to be talking about the US-Japan summit that took place last week, and we have three guests to share their insights with you. Joining us is Abraham Denmark, director of the Wilson Center's Asia program, Shihoko Goto, deputy director for geoeconomics and senior associate for Northeast Asia for that same program, and Melissa Griffith, who is a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation program. To the three of you, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So let me, there's so much to talk about here, but I'm going to begin with coverage from the Japan Times, which said, by the end of the day, it was clear that the two governments had done far more than meet and greet on substance. The joint statement issued after the summit is nothing less than a complete reimagining of the US-Japan partnership for a new era. I'm wondering, in your reactions, is that hyperbole or was it that significant? Abe, let's begin with you.
I think it was very significant, both in terms of some covering some new ground and the ambition, but also in terms of the shift that we've seen in the alliance compared to the previous administration. The statement included a wide variety of different issues, from climate change and development assistance and cooperation on supply chains. But what got the most coverage was that the joint statement explicitly identified Taiwan as a shared interest. It's the first time in the joint statement between the United States and Japan. It appeared since 1969 as President Nixon was trying to end the Vietnam War. So I think those were very significant in terms of ambition, but also it's a return to normalcy, that it's not based on the personalities of the two leaders entirely, but rather it's based on a broad sense of shared interests and common destiny in the face of increasing challenges, specifically deep and explicit concerns about the implications of China's rise.
Thanks. Shihoko, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with that assessment. Just to add a couple more points. One is it made clear that the United States really takes Asia seriously. So here is Biden having a foreign leader to the White House for the first time as president. And usually he would meet with someone from Canada or Mexico to really reinforce that US partnership with North America. But instead, he meets with an Asian country, Japan, and this really articulates the fact that the United States is serious about having close partnerships in the region, and that Japan would play a key role in it. And for Japan, the expectation for Tokyo to do more with the partnership with the United States. So this redefined role that Japan has in partnership with the United States has been made clear. But also finally, the really interesting part is that the narrative of US-Japan relations has really changed. So over the past few decades, it's really been about trade tensions on the one hand and reconciling that with this security alliance that has really defined Japan's security relationship. But in this particular meeting, there was really no talk about trade tensions. That's not to say there aren't any trade tensions there. The United States has a big trade deficit with Japan, especially in the auto sector. But when we talk about economic relations with the United States and Japan, now it's all about cooperation and working together on innovation. And the key buzzwords on this are going to be technology and innovation in areas like AI and semiconductors and big data.
Which is a great segue to Melissa. But if you stand by, Melissa, I do want to ask you one quick follow-up, Shihoko, about the face-to-face nature of the meeting, that it wasn't done by Zoom, that Prime Minister Suga traveled to the United States. How did that play back home? Is this a feather in his cap in some way?
Absolutely. So for Suga, he actually became Prime Minister of Japan last September. So this is his first meeting in Washington as Prime Minister. He will be facing an election before September of this year. And he has really been trying very hard to make sure that the Japanese voters see him as a leader that is worthy of leading a globally present Japan. And this was a performance to the Japanese domestic audience as it was to enhance relations with Washington as well. There has been a lot of credit given to him for taking that on, for meeting with Biden, but at the same time, there has been a lot of concern about what he has promised or what Japan is expected to do as a result of this meeting.
Thanks. Melissa, I'm sure we've all read the joint statement from the White House after the summit. Abe talked about one major headline, Taiwan, which can't be ignored. But if you read down to the next couple paragraphs, it struck me that this sounded like it was certainly a 2021 summit, that even 5 or 10 years ago, there wouldn't have been so many references to so many technologies, specific technologies like 5G. Give us your assessment of that.
I think that's incredibly accurate. There's this sort of changing geopolitical context that sort of the previous two speakers, both Abraham and Shihoko, have sort of spoken about. But I think the other thing that really stood out to me is this technology. It's front and center in understanding the relationship between the United States and Japan, and it's front and center in both countries' aspirations globally. And that took a couple different forms. You mentioned 5G, which if you've been following US news, but also global news, is one of those incredibly pressing critical infrastructure concerns as something in which so many other things will ride. And so this is an area where we're primarily concerned about not having enough vendors, particularly not enough American, European, Japanese, South Korean vendors, Chinese vendors, right? Options other than Chinese vendors, particularly in the radio access network. So have those types of technologies front and center. How can we have our firms compete in a global marketplace and give us alternatives, all right, around this kind of geopolitical tension with China? You also had another technology that's front and center in the news at the moment, and that's semiconductors or integrated circuits, semiconductor chips, integrated circuits. And here you saw a real conversation between the United States and Japan about how to diversify that supply chain, not just on the production side, which tends to be where we focus, because that's where you have the fewest number of vendors, none of which are American. And also importantly, none of the leaders are also Chinese in that space, but that's where you tend to have the chokehold. So you saw a real conversation about diversifying that stack as well, from research and development through to the production, through to packaging and on. And I think that's notable for a couple of reasons, that Japan is sort of the first place as a kind of new administration we're having that conversation. One, it highlights the importance of China to both countries around those concerns and the kind of growing role that that competition takes. The recognition that technology is a deeply intertwined component of that competition. You can't delineate them, kind of pull them apart. And then I think secondly, it also sort of shows Japan's strengths in these spaces as well. So if you look at semiconductors, historically, this is an area where actually the US and Japan have had some tension around semiconductor technology, and they've been a leader in that space. They're also, alongside the United States, one of the leaders today. So if you look at sort of that ecosystem, China's the up and coming player. Countries like the United States, which lead around sort of design tools. If you look at kind of the materials that you need to manufacture, particularly equipment, that's the Netherlands, US, Japan starts to come up there. If you look at production, that's South Korea and Taiwan. So you're sort of seeing this picture emerge where Japan has a leadership position and the United States has a leadership position in amongst its allies. And this is kind of the opportunity to capitalize that in semiconductors, to avoid some of the concerns we've seen around 5G, which is the feeling that we didn't take our initiatives early enough. We didn't see the writing on the wall early enough. And now we're sort of on the back foot trying to catch back up.
But whether we're talking about Taiwan or whether we're talking about 5G, whatever the two leaders discussed, hovering in the background, either explicitly or implicitly, is China. It is one way to interpret this summit a challenge, a direct challenge to China.
I think the Chinese certainly saw it that way. Afterwards, after the summit, the Chinese media put out several statements condemning the peace the summit in various ways. The Xinhua criticized both countries for interfering in China's internal affairs and forming what they called a small clique targeting China, whereas the Global Times, which is always more creative in its use of language, saying that the joint statement demonstrates hypocrisy by the United States and Japan, and urging Japan to rethink the consequences of its statement. So the Chinese understand what's going on. They see the United States working with Japan, working with other countries as a challenge to their ambitions to establish China as the dominant power in the region, and they're going to push back. And they see it as concerning, not only when it comes to Taiwan, but also as further afield as the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and pretty much everywhere where China has ambitions, they're confronted with the prospects of confronting the United States and its allies and partners.
If you look at the rhetoric from the US and Japan, Mr. Biden and Mr. Suga specifically, and then you look at the Chinese pushback, there's a huge gap where one was sort of diplomatic and even tepid, and yet China's was fiery. Were you surprised by how hard China pushed back?
Not really. I think it's pretty predictable. The Chinese have been in what they call a wolf warrior diplomacy mode over the past several months, where they're being more aggressive and more outspoken, but also criticizing those who call the Chinese wolf warriors, even though they're the ones who apply the term themselves. I think they understand what's going on. I was expecting a pretty significant negative reaction to this. But what's important is to recognize is that there's also not everybody's on the same page when it comes to China, even in Japan. That when he came back, Prime Minister Suga also had to explain his approach to these issues, both facing criticism from both the right, saying he wasn't strong enough, but also on the left saying he's too close to the Americans, and walked back a little bit the statements on Taiwan, trying to soften it a little bit when he got back home. So there's a lot of different opinions on there, but definitely the Chinese are very concerned about this, and they're going to push back, I think, very, very predictably.
Along those lines, Shihoko, could you sensitize an American audience to the sensitivities that Prime Minister Suga is dealing with when it comes to China, a major market for Japan and its products?
Right. So for Japan, China is the biggest trading partner. At the same time, it is the biggest security threat as well. And what Japan wants is to have good economic relations with China on the one hand, and to ensure that the security umbrella provided by the United States remains intact. It's a very delicate balancing act, and it's going to be very difficult to maintain that. So what we see from this latest summit is that Japan is moving somewhat more closer to the United States and working together with Washington, defining what the China threat is, defining what engagements that Japan can and should be prepared to do to ensure that it can remain stable. What is interesting, though, is on the economic front, this also gives Japan a new opportunity for reinvigorating itself. So politically, yes, it's greater expectations for what Japan can do on the international arena, but economically, it's about reimagining Japan and its competitive edge. So throughout since the end of World War II, Japan's narrative has been to become this, overcome the destruction of war and kind of lead the so-called Asian tigers into economic rebirth and growth. But that was really through export-led growth of technology goods and manufactured goods. The 21st century is really going to be about the services sector. It's going to be about technology. It's going to be about the things that the United States in particular is at the forefront of, but it does need help. It needs money to invest in. It needs policies that will ensure that America's position is guaranteed to prevail in the future. It needs rules to maintain that position. Japan's interests align very closely with that of the United States in ensuring that there is a free and open market and there is a rules-based way of economic engagement. And so Japan really does want to work together with the United States, but it can be a hard sell for the Japanese domestic audience, which really, especially from the business community, which does not want to antagonize the Chinese market.
And will there be elections in the fall?
Yes, by September, Japan actually does need to have a general election.
So that also factors into the equation for the Prime Minister.
Absolutely. And right now, there's a lot of struggle for Suga to win over the hearts and minds of the electorate. COVID still remains an issue in Japan. The Olympics that Tokyo is supposed to be hosting, there's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to be moving forward. So there's a lot of anxiety amongst voters.
Melissa, in terms of competition in the tech field, China has certainly made its intentions clear, right? That it plans to be dominant when it comes to AI and other technologies. So how significant is a team up between Japan and the United States in challenging those goals?
I think it's fairly significant. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a team up against China, because I think it also is a useful team up just for each other in terms of their own domestic markets and some of their goals independent of China, which I think is sort of an important little course correction there, since these conversations can sort of become an us versus them sometimes, which is not entirely accurate in some of these spaces. But I think it's fairly significant. It's significant for a couple reasons. One, these are historically our partners, right? When we talk about our market positions, the kind of ways we engage economically in the world and the ways we engage in terms of security in the world. So we're reaching two familiar partners, which is a useful starting place. These are countries we have a long-standing history of cooperation with, from everything from trade to security deals, so quite robust. These are also countries, particularly with Japan, that occupy positions of strength in the technologies that we're interested in, which is another very useful starting place. So one of the things that just came up in our conversation is on standards, for example. And standards bodies is one of the areas that have become deeply politicized, both geopolitically and in terms of national kind of policies. And one of the conversations that's come out of this recent summit is that both the United States and Japan need to get ourselves and our firms on the same footing, the same sort of strategy heading into those bodies. We need to be thinking about supporting a greater number of firms to attend those types of forums, so we can do a little bit of a course corrective between largely geopolitical conversations to much more market-led conversations. And that's significant because these are powerful firms that occupy positions of strength in their markets across the board. And I think you also see that when we're looking at specific types of technologies, I think particularly semiconductors. 5G gets a lot of attention given the kind of geopolitical weight there, but with semiconductors, we're in a real moment of opportunity here. There's that joke that the best time to have planted a tree is 10 years ago, and we didn't plant that tree. Well, the second best time is to plant it now. And we're still in an opportunity right now where China's up and coming. A lot of the kind of key positions are in other countries, and we have a really unique opportunity to maintain that dominance, both for our own firms and our own economic well-being, but also for some of these strategic concerns down the line.
Thanks. Abe, oh, go ahead, Shihoko, please.
I was going to say, and just to add, investing in semiconductors is a very expensive business. Manufacturing a fab for semiconductor output costs about $10 billion. And you need to continue to invest in it so that it remains at the cutting edge, producing higher capacity, faster chips. And when a government is laissez-faire, it can not want to make those investments. And having a partnership with another country, especially a country like Japan, that has a strong tradition of industrial policy, can actually work to the US's favor in terms of longer term planning and strategic investment.
Thanks. Abe, what I was going to ask you was I was going to do a plug for your book, your excellent recent book, where you laid out a framework for U.S. engagement in the Asian Pacific. Does this summit move toward the vision that you have in that regard?
Yes, I think so. The argument of the book, put simply, was that U.S. cooperation and collaboration with its allies and partners needs to go beyond the military, that we need to reconceive of alliances as platforms for geopolitical cooperation across all elements of national power. And so to me, cooperating on such a wide variety of issues, from supply chains and climate change all the way to Taiwan and other technologies, really fits the bill there. There's still a lot that needs to be done. There's several areas of disagreement between the United States and Japan that need to be addressed and resolved. But I think this was a very good step in the right direction, and I think a very positive step for the future of this alliance.
What should we expect in terms of follow-up? What has this set the groundwork for? Shihoko, you've already mentioned the need to invest, that talk is cheap, but semiconductors are expensive. So what should we expect in terms of next steps?
Well, one of the things as we face increasing competition with China, China has a roadmap, not just for domestic growth, but also for development assistance outside of its borders through the Belt and Road Initiative, amongst other strategies. The United States has come up with the Free and Open Indo-Pacific platform, which doesn't detail a more comprehensive development strategy. But this could be an opportunity for the countries to really figure out what that roadmap may look like. There are a number of permutations of how that cooperation may look like in terms of the composite of the countries working together. So it's not just simply the Indo-Pacific countries, but specifically we're looking at 4 countries, the Quad, that is to say the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. They're working together on vaccine development and distribution. We've also seen Japan, Australia, India working together on building resilience in the supply chain in Southeast Asia in particular. We can see initiatives moving forward that would strengthen and detail, flesh out some of the economic policies that would be a win-win both for the United States and Japan, but also in Southeast and South Asia as well.
Circling back to Taiwan, I don't want to conclude our discussion before we give that a little more attention, but how should we think about that? Is this a chronic condition that is moving toward an acute stage? The rhetoric has been fairly fiery of late. Where are we on this issue? And what did the statements from Biden and Suga following the summit reveal in that regard as far as where Japan and the US think it's headed?
If I could jump on that. To me, there's tension across the Taiwan Strait has certainly intensified over the past several months. China has been ramping up military pressure on Taiwan, but I haven't seen a substantial change in how Beijing is approaching the issue. It's clear to me that the Biden administration is trying to upgrade the unofficial relationship with Taiwan. It's been done a few things that are a bit technical in the relationship in terms of changing guidelines between how officials between the United States and Taiwan can meet. There's going to be, I expect, more engagements between the United States and Taiwan to ensure Taiwan's ability to defend itself in the form of arms sales that have been going on for decades. So while I think that things have certainly intensified, things have gotten hotter, I don't think we're close to a boiling point yet. What I would be looking for, if things were to really change, would be for statements, indications from Beijing that they no longer believe that time is on their side, if they believe that peaceful unification with Taiwan is no longer a reasonable possibility. And I think a lot of that will depend on their reading of the military balance, their reading of politics in Taiwan, and their reading of American capabilities and commitments in Asia generally, and as it comes to Taiwan in particular.
Thanks. I want to give each of you an opportunity for any final thoughts. You know, one of the problems with a discussion like this is you have a generalist like me leading experts like you on a discussion, and I may be missing something that you think is the most important. So let's go in reverse order of introduction. We'll mix it up. Melissa, what are some things we haven't talked about that you'd like to highlight that you think are important for us to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think for me, there's sort of 3 things going forward that everybody should have in the back of their mind, which is that the aperture is going to have to widen. And what I mean by this is a lot of the problems that are being raised, a lot of the concerns that are being raised in a US-Japan bilateral summit cannot be solved by the US alone, Japan alone, or the US and Japan together. These are much broader issues. And so I think you're going to have to see a widening of that aperture to involve a wider berth of partners. One of which, if we're talking about semiconductors, must be Taiwan, right? One of these significant players that's come up as an area of concern. So I think we have to talk about widening the aperture. I think we need to also talk about prioritization. This was a large laundry list of areas of concern. And as I think has been illustrated, any one of these that you pick up are expensive and complex and global. And so I think there's also going to need to be a little bit of a hierarchy on kind of which issues we're tackling first and how we break those issues apart. Because even if you take something that sounds as simple as an integrated circuit, that is a very complex global supply chain that lasts somewhere up to 18 months for a single chip. That is a deeply complex problem. So even in that area, you're going to have to prioritize. And I think the last piece is we've got to double down. So we do a lot of conversation about where we should be thinking about kind of putting our effort, everything from Open RAN and 5G networks to standards-based bodies to production in semiconductors. All of those things cost money and initiatives and some real commitment on the part of the governments and the firms in these countries. So I think we're going to also have to see some money actually being put down in some real investment. So I would say widen the aperture, prioritize, put some money down.
Thanks, Melissa. Shihoko, any final thoughts from you?
One in particular, the United States has teed up Japan to play an increasingly global role that goes beyond its borders to be more involved in security and defense issues in the region, especially when it comes to Taiwan, but also to provide this longer-term strategy when it comes to economic development and dealing with also some of the social issues as well that are emerging, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but across the world. There is also an opportunity for Japan to be a bridge builder, not just amongst the Indo-Pacific countries, but across Europe as well. When we talk about like-minded countries, geography really actually expands, and the need to bring in European allies, especially not just from the EU, but also from the UK, Japan can actually play an important role in that. And Japan, I believe, has really played an important part in making sure that Britain too realizes its aspirations for global Britain post-Brexit. So those kinds of expectations for Japan are there. The challenge now is for the Suga government to be able to deliver. Again, he is in a very difficult political position. The biggest challenge really is going to be a domestic one, that Japan really does need to provide political stability in order to deliver on the foreign policy objectives that it has for itself and that the world needs from it.
Great. Thanks, Shihoko. Abe, I'll restate my question. Translation, what did I miss?
No, I think you did a great job as always, John. I would just highlight a few things in terms of items to watch in the coming months. Shihoko already mentioned the election that Japan will have to have. That will say a lot about where Japan's future direction is going. But a few other issues that I think the United States and Japan are going to need to wrestle with in the coming months. One is defense spending. As much as Japan talks about its concerns about China and North Korea, its defense spending is still about 1% of GDP. The US, of course, would like to see more as part of Japan's efforts to do more as allies. I expect there's going to be more discussions about US military posture across the Indo-Pacific, but that will have significant implications for Japan and US basing there. Trade is going to be, I think, a continued area of disagreement, as Shihoko mentioned, with Japan being much more positive on multilateral trade arrangements than the United States is. But the last 2 points I think are important, and we didn't cover in great detail. One is China. For all the agreement that we saw in this statement, there's still pretty significant differences in some areas when it comes to between the United States and China, or between the United States and Japan when it comes to China. Segments of Japan's politics want to see a closer relationship with Japan. The economic relationship can't be overlooked, and they want to have a more productive relationship with Japan than maybe some in the United States would like to see. And the last point I'd encourage folks to watch is Southeast Asia. That's becoming a real important theater of competition between the United States and China. And it's I expect going to be an area of cooperation between the United States and Japan. We already saw bits of that in the Quad and other areas of economic engagement, but I think both sides see the geopolitical significance of Southeast Asia and expect to see more cooperation and collaboration between Washington and Tokyo as they engage the ASEAN countries.
Abe Denmark, Shihoko Goto, Melissa Griffith, thank you for a broad and deep encapsulation of the summit. And you've given us a lot to think about looking forward as well. And I want to tell our viewers, if you'd like more excellent content from our guests, you could come to wilsoncenter.org and check out the Asia program, the Science and Technology Innovation Program. I mentioned Abe's book. Their insights are available to you in many ways. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.